This morning, I want us to talk about real life from the life of David. Begin reading with me in Psalm chapter 34, please. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. They looked to him and were radiant. Their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all of his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear him and delivers them. O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in him. O fear the Lord, you his saints. There's no want to those who fear him. The young lions lack and suffer hunger, but those who seek the Lord shall not lack any good thing. Come, you children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Who is the man who desires life and loves many days, that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears, and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart, and saves such as have a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He guards all his bones. Evil shall slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous shall be condemned. The Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who trust in him shall be condemned. In this psalm, David expresses himself and how he feels. In verse 4, he talks about his fears. In verse 6, depending on the translation you're using, he may call himself an afflicted man. The New King James says a poor man. In verse 17, he says that he cries out. And in verse 18, he speaks as one who has a broken heart. To understand this psalm, turn back with me to 1 Samuel chapter 21. 1 Samuel chapter 21. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, beginning in verse 10, going down through verse 14, David begins to describe, or Samuel rather, begins to describe the circumstances of David's life. But before we get to verse 10, we need to back up to verse 1. And in verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 21, it says, Now David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, Why are you alone, and no one is with you? So David said to Ahimelech the priest, The king has ordered me on some business, and said to him, Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you, or which I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, and whatever can be found. And the priest answered David and said, There's no common bread on hand, but there's holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women. Then David answered the priest and said to him, Truly, women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young man are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessels this day. So the priest gave him bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day it was taken away. Now there was a certain man of the servants of Saul was there the day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Dog, an Edomite, a chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. And David said to Ahimelech, Is there here on hand a spear or sword? For I brought neither sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. So the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, it is here, wrapped in cloth behind the ephod. If you take that, take it, for there's no other except that one here. And David said, there's none like it, give it to me. Then verse 10. Then David arose and fled that day from before Saul, and went to Achish the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? Now David took these words to heart, and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, and pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, let his saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all of his father's house heard it, they went to him there. When you look at this event in the life of David, there are several things that stand out in this event. We're going to go back further in the text of Samuel than this, but this is where we want to start. When you look at the life of David, the first thing you're going to see is that David is surrounded by men who are in debt, distress, and who are discontent. The fact of the matter, the heir of David, years later will have himself surrounded by the very same kind of individuals. Individuals in debt, distress, and who are discontent. But prior to the events of verse 10 of chapter 21, I want you to back up to verse 1. Because in verse 1, David has come before Ahimelech the priest. That's his title. Ahimelech is the title for the priest. Like Pharaoh was a title for the pharaohs. Here he comes before the priest, and the priest said, why are you alone? And no one is with you. Have you ever found yourself in a circumstance, and in that circumstance said, man, I wish I hadn't have done that. I wish it hadn't have gone that way. I really wish I could have a do-over on that. Well, that's kind of where David is at here. And so it says in verse 2, David says to Ahimelech, the king has ordered me on some business. And what he's told me is, don't tell anybody why I have sent you, and I've directed my way. Now, therefore, what you have on hand, give me. Well, the king had not ordered David on the business. David is now playing the part of deception with the king, or with the priest. In other words, at this point, he is lying to the priest. He lies to the priest for why he has come before him. The king has not sent him. And then David also demands something to eat from the hand of the priest. And the priest says, we don't have anything for you to eat except for the showbread. We have no meal that is a common meal. And David said, give us the showbread. Now pause. When the Lord will refer to this event in the New Testament, he'll just simply admit that David sinned in doing this. David had no right to ask for the showbread. It was not his to eat. So now David has found himself in a circumstance he wishes he were not in. He'd like to have it over again. And at the same time, now he's lying to the priest. And now he has demanded the right to that which he has no right to eat. And then he asks, do you have any weapons? And he takes the sword with which he had used to slay Goliath. Because he said there's no sword like that. That's the only weapon that he has now. David is fleeing from Saul. And as he flees from Saul, he now comes before Achish the king of Gath, which, by the way, is the very place from which Goliath himself was from. He finds himself in the land of the mortal enemy of Israel, in the land of the champion of all the soldiers of Gath, and he feigns being a madman. And when he's brought to Achish, Achish's response is, why did you bring me another madman? It's as though I've got enough madmen on my hands. The last thing I needed was another madman. Why did you bring me this madman? Well, David realizes that some of the deceit is coming off, and so he departs. And when he departs, it comes to the cave of Adullam. And it then says, furthermore, so when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. It seems like there was some time of separation before David now is rejoined with his family. David is now rejoined with his family in the cave. Before we go back to Psalm chapter 34, there's something else we need to go back in the text and see. Turn back with me in the book of 1 Samuel as well. This time I want you to turn back with me to the book of 1 Samuel, and I want you to turn back with the time that David is being appointed as the king. As David is going to be appointed as the king, Samuel has come into the house of Jesse. And as he has come into the house of Jesse, he inquires if there is one here that he may anoint. And Jesse parades all of his sons, save David, before Samuel. And there's not one that meets the approval of God. And so Samuel says, listen, I'm not going to sit down until I find the one that God has sent me. Do you have another one? And Jesse says, yes, I do have another one. I have a son who's out watching the sheep. He calls for him, and it is David. And Saul anoints David as being the king. Josephus has said at this time that David is about 10 years old. Most, however, are of the opinion that David is about 15 years old at this time, because it'll be another 15 years before David, in fact, becomes the king to sit on the throne. At that time, David would have been somewhere around age 30. And that's usually the time in which kings begin to sit on the throne and begin to reign and begin to rule, as well as the time normally when a priest begins to sit on the throne. In fact, if you'll fast forward to the New Testament, how old is Jesus when he begins his ministry? Jesus is about age 30 when he begins his ministry. So, David is now before Achish. He's not, in fact, serving as king yet, but he's recognized by all that are there. In fact, they recall the time in which David is recognized as slaying his 10,000s while Saul is slaying his thousands. Listen, that's a heady experience. The experience is one in which David is coming back from the battle of having slain Goliath. And he's recognized as the hero of one who has slain Goliath. And recognized as that hero, the ladies begin to recognize him and begin to regale him as their hero. Today, something equivalent to that, similar, maybe not completely parallel, will be, here are the soldiers who come back from battle and war, and they are dressed in their dressed to the T with regard to their military uniforms. They're not in their fatigues. They're dressed in full military regalia. And as they're being paraded down the street, here comes the hero, here comes the conquering generals, and the young women just swoon because they see the conquering heroes, the conquering soldiers. They say, David has slain his 1,000, but Saul has slain his 10,000s. When you come back and you look further in the text of 1 Samuel, you begin to see also that as David is recognized here, you come to chapter 16. You come to chapter 16, and in chapter 16, you have this time in which David is recognized as being the one who is going to be the one who is going to be king. Not only is he now anointed as king, now he also is called before Saul, and Saul is in distress. Saul is in distress, and so David is now called to sing before Saul. And as he's called to sing before Saul, he soothes Saul. So think about it. David is a shepherd. David is now the potential king, and now David is also the sweet singer that is going to soothe the temper of Saul. He is a man who has his plate full, if you will, with regard to everything that he is facing. And now then he's going to be asked by his father, you go and you check on your brothers, and you take this plate full of cheese, and you go check and you see how the soldiers are. David shows up with a plate full of cheese to check on his brothers. And when he does, you come down to verse 27 of chapter 17. And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man who kills. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, why do you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride, the insolence of your heart, for you have come to see the battle. And David said, what, have I behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name should become highly esteemed? David shows up on the scene, and here is Saul and the soldiers of Israel. They ought to be out fighting Goliath. And they're sitting on high center, worried about how they're going to conquer Goliath, and they are in fear. David shows up, this young man about 15 years old, at the behest of his father. He's got to be thinking, this is the army I'm going to rule over one day? These are the men who are going to be my soldiers one day? These men who don't have the gumption to get up and take the battle to the enemy, and they're going to be my army one day? What kind of army is this? And then when he shows up, here are his older brothers. And his older brother, especially Eliab, behaves like an older brother and says, well, we know why you came out. You're just a mischievous little brat. You need to go back home, and you need to go back to watching the sheep. We'll take care of the war. Well, what you see is a little sibling rivalry here. If you're the youngest in the family, have you ever showed up excited to see your older siblings, and the response you get is not one of excitement, but one of contempt because you are the youngest and they are the oldest? Maybe this dynamic doesn't take place in your families. But how many families does it take place where the oldest siblings hold in contempt, despite just short of hate, the younger siblings? And you have this battle that goes on back and forth between the siblings that takes place. The older siblings always feel like the younger sibling is being the favored child. The younger siblings always feel like the older children are getting the break, and they don't get it. And so here you have Eliab, and the response of Eliab is not one of welcoming David. The response of Eliab is that he has David in contempt. You come then further in the book of 1 Samuel. David now goes out to slay the giant. And you come into chapter 18, and you have the song of the women that is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 21, when it says, verse 7, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Oh, that the story would stop there. If the story stopped there, we wouldn't have Psalm 34 and Psalm 56. Because now it's going to get worse. Because you have in verse 8, then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. What saying? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Well, why is Saul angry? Because Saul's the king, and David's this wet pup. He's not the king yet. He's the anointed king. Saul doesn't yet realize the kingdom has been, his rule as king has been taken away, and Saul and David has been anointed as king. And now David is being regaled as the hero, and Saul doesn't have his place being recognized as the king. It's like, I'm the king and you don't give me my rightful honor. And now he is angry about that. Then it says, verse 9, Saul eyed David from that day forward. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside his house. So David played music with his hand at other times, but there was a spear in the other hand. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. You ever work for a boss like that? Here you do the best you can to serve the boss, the best you can to turn a profit for the boss, the best you can to make the boss look good, and the response of the boss is jealous, and the very first thing you know, the boss is throwing a spear at you. Maybe not literally, but metaphorically, figuratively, a spear at you, and what he's now trying to do is he's going to try to ruin you. Here you've done everything you possibly can to try to make the boss look good, the business profitable, the kingdom good in David's sake, in David's situation. And Saul's response is that he's angry and he throws the spear at him. Is it any wonder then that it says in verse 9, so Saul eyed David from that day forward? Do you remember the promise that Saul made to the man that slew the giant? That a part of that promise was that David would have, that the person that slew the giant would have Saul's daughter as a wife. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 17. Then Saul said to David, here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. So David said to Saul, who am I? And what is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be son-in-law to the king? But it happened at that time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Mehothite, say that 10 times real quick, as his wife. Here's David going to be the son-in-law, and Saul is trying to pin him to the wall with a spear. He promises Merab, and then pulls the rug out from David and says, no, you can't have her. I'm going to give you Michal. Now I realize that there's no son-in-law that is ever worthy enough to be a husband for our daughters. They kind of have to earn that place in the Father's eye. But how many times have you showed up to a wedding and the father is walking the bride down the aisle, and he gets to the point where he meets the groom and the best man, and instead of handing his daughter's hand to the groom, he takes the best man and pulls the best man out forward and gives her hand to the best man? How many times have you seen the bride given to someone other than the intended groom? We've seen this before with Jacob and Leah and Rachel. And now then Saul is going to pull this fast one. And so then it says in verse 20, now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give her to him. Why? That she may be a snare to him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law today. David is now told by others, David, this is your wedding day. This is going to be the day that's going to be your day of rejoicing, the bright day in your life, and you're going to have Merab for your wife. And David is saying, no, I'm not. He gave her to somebody else. I'm going to have Michal. Now, the text doesn't indicate that's a step down for David. In fact, the text tells us that David loved Michal and Michal loved David. And so you come down now to verse 26. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days did not expire. Therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 Philistines. Why? Because Saul had required of David 100 foreskins of Philistines, and David says, no, I'm going to double that amount. And David goes out with his men, and he slays the Philistines. So you come to verse 30. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. We come now to chapter 19. And in chapter 19, you have the events in which Jonathan and David are together. David needs a best friend. And Jonathan is going to be David's best friend. The problem with that is Jonathan is the son of the king who's trying to ruin David, who just betrayed David by reneging on the promise of giving him Merab. Saul is now determined to undo David. He's determined to kill David. And Saul and Jonathan make this pact that says, I tell you what, you go out from the city and you stay, and in 3 days, you give me 3 days to be with the king. And in 3 days, I will come out, and I will have my servant come out, and I will shoot a bow. I'll shoot an arrow. And if I send my servant out and you hear me say to the servant, go further, then you will know that you need to leave the country because my father has not been appeased. My father is still angry with you. If you hear me say to the servant, come near, then you will know it will be safe to come back into the city. And so, Jonathan goes out, flings his arrow, and says to the servant, go further, go further. And David knows to flee from the hand of Saul, because Saul has not been appeased in his anger with David. Verse 1 of chapter 21. Now David came to Nob and Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, why are you alone and no one is with you? Do you see what's been taking place up to this time in the life of David? David has had this great monumental event of being anointed as king at age 15, possibly. And from that point forward, things just kind of roll down the hill for David. He slays the giant in a time when victory ought to be his. But instead, he enrages the king. And instead, now he's running for his life. And now running for his life, he comes to who? He comes to Achish, the king of Gath. And he lies about having come before the priest. He eats the showbread. And he also deceives the king. You've kind of got to ask, can it get any lower for David? Well, it's going to get lower for David later on in his life. But all these events have taken place, and now we come to Psalm 34. In Psalm chapter 34, this is a psalm in conjunction with Psalm chapter 56 that David writes. And notice what he says in verse 11. Come, you children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. When he says, come, you children, he's not suggesting little ones like we have on the front few seats here, or the ones we hold in our arms. The little ones he's talking about are his family and the 400 men that had been with him in the cave of Adullam. And at that time he says, let me teach you something. You want to know how to live life and love life and live good days? Then let me tell you how to do that. Hold your finger there, put your marker there, and turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 3. Because what you find is you find this very scenario, you find these very words played out in 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 10. For who would love life and see good days? Let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lip from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Why is Peter using this? Has Peter ever played the part of deception? Has Peter ever denied God? Because the problem with David was really he denied God. Has Peter ever acted the part of deception? Has Peter ever lied? Has Peter ever denied God? Yes. And Peter turns to what? He turns to what David says with regard to how you live life and see good days. And what he's saying is, I want you to recognize I have done the very same thing that David has done. Turn to Psalm 56 real quickly. Psalm 56. And look at verses 8 through 10, because this is the answer that David gives in this. Psalm 56 and verses 8 to 10. You number my wanderings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? When I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back. Then I know, because God is for me. In God I will praise His word. In the Lord I will praise His word. In God I have put my trust. I will not be afraid what man can do to me. Is it any wonder then in verse 1 of Psalm 34, David said, I will magnify the Lord? He's denied the Lord. He's lied. He's played the part of deception. And David has been overwhelmed. There's been spiritual fatigue that has overwhelmed David. And he sought the answer for himself. And finally he says, when I cried, the tears were in a bottle that the Lord had. Have you ever had the situation seemingly so dark in your life? The circumstances turn against you. You've had those moments in which things just seem, you try to do what is right. And every time you try to do what is right, there's just something that happens that just turns against you. And the moments seem dark. And you cry, literally or figuratively, you cry and you wonder, does anyone ever hear? Here I am, I'm trying to do right in this marriage, and it's just not working out. I'm trying to do right in my life, in a society, but it's just not working out. And what we do then is we begin to deny the Lord and run from the Lord. And David says, no, that's not the answer. And Peter says, that's not the answer. The answer is that you turn to the Lord, not run to the Lord, because verse 12 of 1 Peter 3 says, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. What David is saying is, my life is often the life of Peter. And what Peter is saying is, David's life has been my life. But come to verse 13 of 1 Peter chapter 3. And now we see it becomes our life. And who is he who will harm you if you'll become followers of what is good? Ask David that question. David, who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? Saul. Ask Peter that question. Who is he who will harm you if you become followers who have good? Nero, the Roman government. But there's someone that can harm us worse than the king and the government. And that's me. That's you. Flip the question. And who is he who will harm you if you forsake zeal in becoming a follower of the Lord? No one can harm us like we can harm ourselves. And sometimes the reason that every time we try to do what is right, we're met with something dark is because, like David, we have made the wrong decisions along the way. And like Peter, we've made the wrong decisions along the way. But when we can make the right decision, and like Peter and like David, then turn to the Lord, then who is he who's going to harm those who follow the Lord? We've got time for prayer and one verse of a song. Let us pray.